Hi, I'm Peter J. Ray. Welcome to Adventures in History. Today's topic is Franklin Pierce, Part 1, Young Hickory of the Granite Hills. Franklin Pierce was the 14th U.S. President. He was elected in 1852, served one term from 1853 to 1857. He was one of the three presidents that presidential historians have traditionally ranked very low, I think unfairly, along with his predecessor and successor, Millard Fillmore and James Buchanan, the three presidents before the U.S. Civil War, who, because of politics and because of the suffering caused by the Civil War, became scapegoats, and I think were very unfairly blamed as being poor presidents. And basically, Franklin Pierce, like the other two, I believe was pretty much a hopeless situation as the division over slavery between North and South was growing more and more severe. And I think, Franklin Pierce deserves a lot of credit for trying to do his best in a hopeless situation, in a very tragic situation, as the country was basically headed towards the worst thing that can happen and that's a civil war. And actually at the same time he was going through his own terrible personal tragedy with the death of his son. Franklin Pierce, they called him Frank. He never lost an election, although he was not nominated by the Democratic Party in 1856 because he had become unpopular. He was a master of knowing how to get along with people. Yeah, he was a people person. He really very outgoing, friendly, and he was a good guy. He really was fed up with the abolitionist movement, and whom he blamed for the growing conflict between North and South. He was able to, President Pierce was able to greatly reduce the federal debt. Some reports say from 60 million to 11 million. He was very good-looking, handsome man, very strong. Again, he was amiable, congenial, got along very well with others. He enjoyed interacting with other people. Franklin Pierce was the youngest man elected to the presidency at the time. He was a few days before his 48th birthday. Of course, later presidents were younger, including Theodore Roosevelt and John F. Kennedy. Now, he and his wife had three children, all sons, and they all died young, two very, very young. And one, I think, a couple days after birth, another, I believe, age 2, and the third, age 11, shortly after he was elected president. And so he was dealing with the presidency while suffering grief and personal depression. His wife, Jane, was a very troubled person, and his marriage was not very helpful. She was a very depressed woman. Very shy, and actually she really hated politics. She was definitely not a political asset, and I think also wasn't very helpful to him in terms of life itself because of her terrible unhappiness, although he remained very devoted to her throughout their marriage. Franklin Pierce is the only person elected president from New Hampshire, from the state of New Hampshire. He served in the Mexican War, achieved distinction there. He was very dedicated to the Democratic Party. Again, he had a severe conflict with the abolitionist movement, and he took offense with their holier-than-thou attitude and condemning as sinners anyone who would not join them. Interestingly, during his college days, he had friends. Two of his college friends included Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and a famous author, and Nathaniel Hawthorne, author of The Scarlet Letter and The House of Seven Gables. Franklin Pierce's father served in the Revolutionary War and was governor of New Hampshire. Tragically, Franklin Pierce developed alcoholism. He battled with that and was able to quit drinking, but in the end, that was his undoing, as he was overwhelmed by the tragedies of the country and his own personal life. He was elected to the House of Representatives and to the Senate, and in the 1852 election, the Whig candidate was Winfield Scott, who was his commanding general in the Mexican War. His wife's name was Jane Appleton Pierce, Again, it was very tragic. Their 11-year-old son, Benjamin, who was killed in a railroad accident a couple months after the 1952 election, and shortly, a couple months before, he was inaugurated. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, and which President Pierce signed, and which is the thing that he was most known for and criticized for. And this allowed for the possibility of slavery in what would become the state of Kansas, and meant the expansion of slavery into the north, at least the northwest. And this was very offensive to many people. And it actually led to Kansas, the territory of Kansas, becoming a battleground, people fighting. It was like a prelude to the Civil War. During President Pierce's time in office, the Gadsden Purchase took place, in which the southern Arizona and New Mexico were purchased from Mexico for $10 million, and that completed the map of the continental United States. Eventually, he became very unpopular in New Hampshire. He was from the north, but he was president of the whole country, and that meant trying to satisfy the South. But that, of course, as the country was headed toward war, he was considered, an enemy in the North, of the North, by the time the Civil War came and afterward. By the time he died, he was very unpopular in the North, and it was more than 50 years before a statue was erected in his honor, because, again, he was a scapegoat in the Civil War, for the suffering of the Civil War, along with James Buchanan and Millard Fillmore and others. Another nickname was Handsome Frank. He was very, very good looking. Jefferson Davis, who became the president of the Confederacy, was a good friend of Franklin Pierce, became a good friend of his in Congress in Washington. And Davis's wife had this to say about Franklin Pierce, that he scolded so gently that, quote, the sting was all taken out. Franklin Pierce's administration was one of prosperity. The California gold rush was ongoing. Railroads were being built all over, and especially going west. Henry David Thoreau's famous book, Walden, was published. Longfellow's Song of Hiawatha also was published, and Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, a fine book of poetry. Stephen Foster, who was a famous musical writer of the time, wrote My Old Kentucky Home Good Night, which became a famous song. And Christmas 1855, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, was sang as a Christmas carol for the first time during President Pierce's time in office. Franklin Pierce was born on November 23rd, 1804 in Hillsborough, Vermont, one of 9 children. He was the 6th of 9. His father, Benjamin Pierce, again served in the Revolutionary War. He had a variety of occupations. He was a farmer, tavern keeper, and a leader in the Democratic Party in New Hampshire. He fought, Benjamin Pierce, his father, fought in the battles of Breed Hill and Ticonderoga, and he was at Valley Forge during that famous winter of privation with the Continental Army and General George Washington during the American Revolution. Franklin Pierce was not a scholar. He was not particularly scholarly. He loved the great outdoors and physical activity, including swimming, fishing, and ice skating. Again, he was very personable, charming, and popular. He was an honest man, polite and poised. He was a good man, and deserves to be remembered as such. Franklin Pierce went to Bowdoin College and graduated there in 1824. Again, famous classmates, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow and Nathaniel Hawthorne. He graduated at age 19, third in his class. He actually didn't do so well at the beginning, but picked up his grades. Very small class, and Nathaniel Hawthorne became his lifelong friend. Again, he was not a studious person, very physical and outgoing, loved physical activity. Bowdoin College is in Brunswick, Maine. And one of Franklin Pierce's biographers, Roy Franklin Nichols, wrote this quote, "The chief of Bowdoin's gifts to Franklin were friendship, the mystery of religion, and the consciousness of victory snatched from defeat. These Bowdoin had given him in generous measure." After finishing college, he studied to be a lawyer, and he was admitted to the bar to practice law in 1827. That same year, his father was elected governor of New Hampshire, so he had a famous father. And he, after being admitted to the bar, Franklin Pierce opened a law office in Hillsborough, New Hampshire. 2 years later, 1829, Franklin Pierce began serving in the New Hampshire state legislature, so he was elected at a fairly young age. And during this time, Andrew Jackson had been elected president and was dominant in the Democratic Party, and Franklin Pierce had a lifelong dedication to Andrew Jackson and the Jacksonian Democratic Party. Now, in his legal career, one of the things, since he was so outgoing, he loved talking to people, he did have a good memory. He would learn people's names, and he'd see them and greet them by name, and this was very helpful. He could really knew a lot of people. People love being identified and greeted by name. Again, very charming, amiable, and had empathy. He cared about other people. He was a good man. He won it was said he won many of his legal cases by appealing to the emotions of the jurors. So he was very good in the courtroom, speaking to the jury, making a good impression. Now, at this time, Concord was the capital of New Hampshire, still is, I believe, and again, this was his first term in the state legislature. He still had his legal career. Roy Franklin Nichols wrote, quote, "The Democratic Party was to become for Franklin Pierce, his family, his fraternity, his church, and his country." Yes, he was very, very dedicated to the Democratic Party. I'm sure that was pleasing to Martin Van Buren, the creator of the modern Democratic Party. Franklin Pierce had this to say in 1829, quote, "It is a fact, so far as our happiness is concerned, it matters not where we are, so that we are satisfied with our situation, and whether we will be satisfied or not depends upon ourselves. There is nothing which so certainly establishes our prosperity as constant industry, and a spirit of stern, self-relying perseverance, which quails not before adversity, nor is elated by good fortune. And nothing surely contributes so much to our happiness as a fixed determination to be satisfied with the lot fortune has cast for us. You know, my doctrine is that almost everything depends upon ourselves. We can be satisfied if we will. By 1833, Pierce was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from New Hampshire. So you can see his political career was really going very, very well. And again, he was dedicated to President Andrew Jackson and the Democratic Party. November 10th, 1834, Franklin Pierce married Jane Means Appleton, who was the daughter of the president of Bowdoin College. Now, they were a very unlikely pair. You could argue that they were mismatched, but I guess it was meant to be. She came from a wealthy Federalist family, so they were not exactly on the same page politically, although she had no interest in politics. Jane, his wife Jane, was shy, and she had poor health her whole life, and was also sad very often, suffered depression, and she hated politics, so that was very unfortunate. Roy Franklin Nichols wrote, quote, "Jane Appleton Pierce was shy, retiring, frail, and tubercular, well bred in the straitest sect of New England theocracy, with a host of substantial and aristocratic connections, and very strict ideas of propriety. Her husband presented quite a contrast, buoyant, vain, social, at home in political caucus and tavern, son of the frontier. They were ill-mated, but for 30 years they lived together, he dividing himself between politics and law, giving her a very real affection and love, which made her the center of his thoughtful attention. She shyly appreciative, but unresponsive, often oppressed by ill health and melancholy, hating politics and public life." Yeah, so Jane did not enjoy really the entertainment part of politics, which is so important, which the wives are expected to be involved in, certainly hosting parties and dinners and get-togethers. Jane's parents came from two wealthy New England families who made their fortunes from the textile industry, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It was said that she was imbued with a warped religious fanaticism. Her father the president of Bowdoin College, had killed himself through sacrificial fasting. So I guess he just didn't eat enough and eventually died. Very tragic. Jane had tuberculosis, and when Franklin Pierce was elected to Congress during his times off, sometimes she would come to Washington, sometimes she'd stay in New Hampshire, and she had trouble deciding which. She was lonely. She missed him in New Hampshire, but she really didn't like Washington. Now, when Pierce was in Washington, there were all these men, congressmen, and it was said there was a boisterous life there, a lot of drinking. So if you had a tendency toward alcoholism, then Washington, D.C. might not be the best place for you. Now, there was in 1835 the issue to ban slavery in Washington City, and ongoing debate over slavery. Again, Pierce hated the abolitionists. He found them, he believed that they were dividing the country, and he didn't like their attitude of superiority and condemnation. Franklin Pierce biographer Michael F. Holt wrote, quote, "Never a particularly religious or pious man, quite unlike his new wife, he found the holier-than-thou attitude of abolitionists and their penchant for condemning anyone who did not join their movement as a sinner deeply offensive, even intolerable." Yeah, no one likes being condemned, and that was really their weakness. The abolitionist movement, they would they would state their case, and if you didn't join them, then you were a sinner, you were evil, and people like to take their time, and they don't like being condemned. Michael F. Holt wrote, continued, quote, "Equally important, Franklin Pierce feared that abolitionist agitation, if unchecked, could rend the nation his revered father had fought to create. Franklin Pierce was committed to the preservation of the Union, and he resented and rejected anything that he believed might threaten its perpetuity." Yeah, so this was his problem with the abolitionists. The other problem is that he believed they were helping to break up the country, which of course they were, along with, of course, the issue of slavery itself. Now, Franklin Pierce and Jane, they had their home in Hillsborough, New Hampshire, and he had his legal career and also his political career. One of his law students who was studying under him was a young man named Albert Baker, and Baker's sister was Mary, and when she became eventually married, her full name was Mary Baker Eddy. And it was reportedly Mary was inspired by Franklin Pierce, and that inspiration was a part of her life. And later she founded the Church of Christ Scientist. So he was connected to Mary Baker Eddy. 1836, February 2nd, Jane gave birth to a boy, Franklin Jr., and the baby tragically died only 3 days later, shortly after birth. Franklin Pierce wrote, quote, "He who has lived 30 years in this world of ours, seen its vanity, its inanity, and felt its miseries, ought not to repine at or weep over the demise of an infant. But alas, what has our experience, or what has philosophy to do with the feelings of a father?" So Franklin and Jane, they lost their first son tragically, shortly after birth. That same year, Pierce was labeled a doughface, along with others who were against the abolitionist movement and were interested in having peace with the South, or supposedly a Northerner with Southern sympathies. The same year, he was elected to the U.S. Senate. You can see he was only 32 years old, the youngest U.S. senator ever at that time. So you can see how quickly his political career was evolving. Michael F. Holt wrote, quote, "The striking ease of his political ascent. On Pierce's part, this was primarily attributable to his amiable personality and his astonishing memory for people's names and faces." Yeah, people liked Franklin Pierce. That same year, they decided, Franklin and Jane, that life in Hillsborough was not ideal because the town was too small, which made it difficult to earn a living as a lawyer. And Jane did not like the small town, so they decided to move to Concord, the capital of New Hampshire. Of course, that's also where the state legislature was. Jane was ill, on and off throughout her life, and that summer she was ill, and the medical procedure was to try leeches to restore her health. Oh boy! A friend of Pierce named Horatio Bridge had this to say about Franklin Pierce's election to the U.S. Senate in 1836, quote, "An instance of what a man can do by trying. With no remarkable talents, Franklin Pierce at the age of 34 fills one of the highest stations in the nation." So, part of their lives were spent in Washington, much of their lives, and there was a description of Jane in Washington that she was, quote, "in very delicate health and wanting in cheerfulness." Yeah, not a happy or healthy person. That same year, Franklin Pierce's sister Harriet was seriously ill, and his beloved father had a stroke. March of 1837, it was reported, according to Roy Franklin Nichols, quote, "A mob invaded the House of Representatives, a mob of beautiful ladies who supplied sufficient hubbub to hamper effectually much of the business before the House. The presiding officers were helpless against the fair invaders, as most of them stayed until nearly midnight." Well, that's certainly a mysterious thing that happened here. No more information. One of the mysteries of history. Wonder what that was all about. 1837, Roy Franklin Nichols wrote, quote, "That winter, a young planter from Mississippi had visited Washington, hoping that the gay life of the capital might divert his flagging spirits and shaken health. A number of pleasant acquaintanceships were formed in that convivial atmosphere, among of them one that was to become historic, for it was during this winter that Jefferson Davis and Franklin Pierce became friends. Of course, Davis became the president of the Confederacy. He served on Pierce's cabinet, and then, of course, when the Civil War started, this sort of contributed to people saying, that Franklin Pierce was a traitor, all this nonsense, based on the tragedy of the war and scapegoating. 1837, Senator Pierce began serving in the U.S. Senate from New Hampshire. And he was, again, the youngest. There were many famous senators during that time, including Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, and James Buchanan. Roy Franklin Nichols wrote this about Franklin Pierce. He wrote that he was, quote, "an industrious and loyal young man, whose chief pleasure was to be thought well of by his elders." That same year, Pierce's nephew, Scott McNeil, was killed in Florida, serving in the U.S. Army, fighting against the Seminole Indians. 1838, Jane had this to say, quote, "Oh, how I wish Franklin was out of political life. How much better it would be for him on every account." Yes, she did not encourage his political career at all. June was very hot. Of course, every summer is hot in Washington. And Roy Franklin Nichols wrote about the summer of 1838 in Washington City, quote, "In this torrid heat, Jane Pierce wilted and took to her bed. Her doctor did his best, but she and her husband would find no help until they reached the refuge of the New Hampshire hills." Franklin Pierce, that same year, 1838, had this to say about the U.S. Congress, quote, "In a body where there are more than 100 talking lawyers, you can make no calculation upon the termination of any debate, and frequently the more trifling the subject, the more animated and protracted the discussion." So by August, Franklin and Jane moved to Concord, New Hampshire, which was their principal residence for the rest of their lives. And his law partner at the time was Asa Fowler. Roy Franklin Nichols wrote this about Franklin Pierce's legal partner. Asa Fowler was cautious and hard-working, where Pierce was careless and easygoing. September of 1839, Jane gave birth to a second son, Frank Robert. Franklin Pierce's legal career at that time was not going well, and there were financial difficulties. Roy Franklin Nichols wrote, quote, "In Washington, Franklin Pierce was too easily prey to the jovial and reckless life of the politicians, and his sojourns there were also made uncomfortable by frequent illness. Mrs. Pierce hated the capital, and it is difficult to discover which was harder for her to bear, going to Washington with her husband or being separated from him by remaining in New England." Of course, she was insistent that he leave politics. So she was pressuring him to get out of politics. Yeah, well, if he was in Washington and she wasn't, chances are he would be drinking. Franklin Pierce's mother died in 1838 and his father in 1839. Roy Franklin Nichols wrote, quote, "The birth of his son, Frank Robert, gave his father a new purpose in life and a new reason for greater care in his living. In the absence of his wife in Washington, he adopted a stern and regular regimen and fortified himself to battle with temptation, loneliness, ill health, and religious doubt." Now that contradicts what I just said, that he would be exercising discipline not to drink in Washington, even though his Jane wasn't there. 1841, Jane gave birth to their third son on April 13th, Benjamin. And that same year, Pierce gave up alcohol and tobacco. 1842, Pierce resigned from the Senate because of these were his wife's wishes, and he wanted to be a good family man. Roy Franklin Nichols wrote, quote, "Franklin Pierce's departure caused some regret among many of his colleagues. He had been a pleasant and engaging companion. He had never been afraid of hard work and had been ever a loyal party man. During his time in the U.S. Senate, he worked on military affairs, and also he was dedicated to caring for the veterans of the American Revolution." So they returned to New Hampshire, and actually this was not the end of his political career. He became a political boss in New Hampshire, very active in the state. He just wasn't in Washington. He took a temperance pledge in 1842, meaning, I'm not going to drink. The temperance movement wanted to ban alcohol. In fact, Franklin Pierce became president of the New York State Temperance Association. And part of the reason, he was aware of his drinking issues, and by coming home to New Hampshire, he could avoid the heavy drinking culture in Washington City. But he remained dedicated to the Democratic Party and unity for that organization in New Hampshire and the United States. And of course, the abolitionist movement was undermining that unity and not only breaking apart the Democratic Party, but the country. So their home was in Concord, New Hampshire. Now, during his legal career, he's busy. Major political issues of the time were railroads and building railroads west. The temperance movement and slavery was an ongoing topic of debate. Roy Franklin Nichols wrote, quote, "Although ex-Senator Pierce came home to Concord with his public career as he thought behind him, he did not reckon with the qualities of attraction possessed by the political game. Politics in New Hampshire was like intermittent fever. No one infected with it was ever long without it." Okay, so they had 1842. There were elections for the New Hampshire legislature, and Roy Franklin Nichols described the process. Part of the process, quote, "Voters were harangued by speakers who grew constantly hoarser as the nights wore on." Again, the temperance movement was very popular. Of course, alcoholism is such a destructive thing. So many lives and there's so much suffering caused by alcoholism, and so there were folks who believed it should become illegal. Roy Franklin Nichols wrote with respect to this, quote, "Such an issue was one which Franklin Pierce could appreciate. One of the hidden phases of his career was his struggle with an alcoholic craving. It had marred his congressional experience and had caused him considerable uneasiness when at home. Franklin Pierce joined the temperance cause with intense enthusiasm." Yeah, see, there were reports of his that he'd been drinking issues. Well, that concludes today's presentation. We'll continue next time with part 2 of the interesting life of Franklin Pierce, 14th U.S. President. Good luck to you with your efforts in American history. There's so many wonderful history books, so much to be learned in history, American history, world history, or whatever. If you might consider checking out, you might consider checking out our website, Adventures in History with Peter J. Ray at peterjray.com. So far, we've made 695 history videos in 7 areas: world history, American history, book reviews, poetic tours, Cleveland baseball, family history, and autobiography. There's a donate feature. You might consider making a donation so we can continue making these videos. If you live in Metro Manila, Philippines, and are looking for a high school, you might consider, oh boy, I'm having problems with my neck. You might consider Restless Educational Center. Restless is located on Allenby Street, the inclined plane, not far from the corner of P. Guevara and Wilson Street in San Juan, Metro Manila, Philippines. At Restless, we specialize in helping young people who have had difficulty in the larger traditional high schools. We're more than a school, we're a warm, supportive community, and we strive to be creative and innovative for the students to enjoy going to school. And the website is restless.education, RESALEST. Thanks so much for watching. Really appreciate it. God bless you. Take care. And I'll see you next time.